If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Daniel Spaulding back on the show. Daniel earned a BA in English Literature from Bridgewater State University. He currently works and lives in Seoul, South Korea, where he began contributing to several online projects, including The Soul of the East and Alternative Right, that bastion of neo-Nazism, right? His writing focuses on foreign policy, politics, philosophy, and Eastern and Western culture. Dan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you tonight?
Very good. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Glad to be back.
And, I thought maybe we discuss what's going on the Korean peninsula right now. It seems to be Korea has been set up by the New World Order, the globalists, as sort of a perennial hotspot. Keeps the world on edge, the masses confused, and continually flees because it helps support the military-industrial complex. And you have this latest war scare. I see this as sort of a strategy of tension, theatrics. Would you agree?
It certainly is on one level. I mean, as far as both sides are concerned. Relating specifically to North Korea, I'm very skeptical of how advanced their supposed nuclear and missile, programs are. It seems there's a lot of fake videos and photographs, staged things. So I certainly think North Korea is exaggerating and sort of puffing up its program and making themselves look much more serious than perhaps they really are. And on the other hand, the U.S. is only too happy to indulge that narrative, and American media especially. I have the misfortune of having to see CNN on a regular basis, and I see how they just, CNN and all these so-called foreign policy experts, just peddle this stuff without any sort of empirical evidence or any physical evidence to justify these claims that North Korea is this huge threat that they're presenting it as. It seems a lot of hot air and a lot of theatrics on both sides more than anything. Yeah, I mean,
it's alleged nuclear program, so this ramshackle program. They seem to pull it out every 4 to 6 months. At least the American mainstream media tends to focus on it every 4 or 6 months. And the saber rattling by the North Koreans is sort of, at least in the recent past, has been designed to sort of get some sort of concessions out of the West. But now you have obviously the matters on the Korean Peninsula would be helped greatly if the U.S. Stopped engaging in these military exercises, which were very, very provocative given the history of North Korea, how it was, pretty much bombed back to the Stone Age during the Korean War. And, of course, the placement of, 28,000 U.S. troops there is sort of this tripwire. We are told that South Korea is on the verge of being invaded. It's very vulnerable, yet its economy is, 30, 40 times that of North Korea. It has a very modern army. It's probably a generation two beyond whatever North Korea has. Although North Korea's army is large, it's very dependent on China. So any sustained military attack just is unthinkable. Now, I don't know, you're there, and I don't necessarily think you have, the pulse of the Korean people, how they feel, how they think. But the media there, is it true that Americans seem to be more alarmed about North Korea than South Koreans?
Definitely. Koreans are kind of, at this point, shrug this stuff off, when it comes around every once or twice a year. For them, it's the same old song and dance. They've heard it all before. It's happens every year. There's some bluster exchanged between Pyongyang and Washington, and then after a few months it disappears or dies down. So people, nothing ever really seems to come of it. I think the only difference this time around is Trump is much more, I guess, I don't know, maybe perhaps due to his New York background or whatever, but is much more kind of eager to match Pyongyang in the rhetoric department, the fire and fury and whatever other things he was saying. But in terms of the actual substance, rhetoric aside, the substance, I mean, this is nothing new. You get these missiles being tested or allegedly being tested and fired off every few months, but nothing ever seems to really come of it one way or the other. So people here are pretty, indifferent to it at this point. They don't take it, what can they do about it at this point? They're pretty resigned to it all. And on the other hand, don't expect much to happen from it. So I think definitely seeing reaction in the U.S. I mean, again, I haven't been physically in the U.S. for several years, but just judging from social media and the mainstream media and sort of other similar outlets seem much more hysterical about it than people in the Korean Peninsula.
You have full access to U.S. media in Korea, right? So you can probably
unfortunately.
Yes, you do. Yeah, because I don't think it'd be naive to impute pure intentions on the part of Washington in protecting South Korea. I mean, obviously, heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula provided a pretext for, the continued deployment of U.S. military forces in the region, in Asia. It's called this Asian pivot, or Pacific pivot, whatever you want to call it. So this enables the United States to project hard power in Asia under the pretext of promoting, peace and stability, the old song and dance of the American empire. So, I mean, yeah, reasons for skepticism are sound, yeah.
Well, not only that, but I mean, I do notice that, and it happened, with the past several administrations, but we keep hearing this phrase, all options are on the table. And I think most recently, Secretary of Defense Mattis made this comment. But the one option that never seems to be on the table is direct negotiations without preconditions. I mean, it's all either Pyongyang bends completely to Washington's demands, or there can be no negotiation. So, I think in terms of this issue, whatever one thinks of Pyongyang, on the other hand, certainly I don't think Washington can claim it's acting in purely good faith either here.
Well, just simply things like maybe establishing diplomatic relations would be a step in the right direction. I mean, it's a bad government, an abhorrent regime, but the world's full of them. We have diplomatic relations.
Yeah, the world's full of them, and the U.S. is quite willing to deal with most of the other ones.
Yeah,
I mean, the U.S. seems to have minimal qualms about dealing with rather nasty regimes like Saudi Arabia, a lot of the other countries in the Arab Gulf, China, etc., who's the U.S. loves to present itself as this human rights champion, but it throws that out the window when it comes to dealing with these other governments, but in the case of North Korea, which I honestly have come to believe a lot of the stuff we're told about North Korea, again, not to sugarcoat them or anything, but a lot of that stuff is in itself propaganda by Seoul in Washington to put North Korea in the worst light possible, as they're this totally demonic, satanic regime, which I don't think. I mean, there's a lot of bad things going on there I wouldn't want to live under, but to present them as absolute evil so that Washington can present it as itself as absolute good is quite foolish in my opinion. But nevertheless, Washington doesn't want to seem to operate in good faith here. It doesn't want to just sit down and talk. It's Washington seems, when it comes to not just North Korea, but even other governments that are not playing by Washington's game. Washington has this you either accept all our terms or we're not going to deal with you in any positive way whatsoever. So there's no diplomatic good faith coming from Washington.
Yeah, there really is no diplomacy. It's just they're given orders, and if they don't follow the orders, then they're outside the family of civilized nations, and they have to be marginalized as this rogue nation, that's outside the control of the Anglo-American sphere. But yeah, I find it interesting because you look at the whole history of Korea itself, its role in the New World Order. I mean, that is the post-war era, how it was sort of set up. Like the same thing occurred in Vietnam, was sort of set up to be divided and create a hotspot for the Cold War. I think the received history, at least the official narrative, is that there was this unprovoked invasion by the North in June 1950, and no one saw it coming, which is absurd if you really think about it. And people who've done the research in this found that the invasion was foreseen, in fact provoked. Dean Acheson putting it outside America's defense perimeter in that speech in, I think, the early winter of 1950, and then you have Stalin giving the okay to invade, supposedly, but you also have this idea that they were able to amass this invasion without any knowledge by U.S. intelligence, and that's been contradicted by research that apparently John Foster Dulles had told Syngman Rhee that unification was coming. Syngman Rhee, I think, he was a dictator, the first dictator of South Korea that was installed by the West. So called 1950 the year of unification, and there are dozens of cross-border disputes, from what I understand. I can't claim to be have any special historical knowledge of the what was going on in the 50s, but my basic understanding is, yes, the U.S. had a warning that the North was going to attack the South in 50s. Yeah, but similar with the Pearl Harbor type situation, where FDR. I think it's hard to dispute at this point. I know the mainstream historians would rather suppress it and ignore it, but it does seem pretty indisputable at this point that, for example, FDR had advanced knowledge of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and kind of deliberately did nothing because he wanted it to happen. And I think you had a similar situation here where, Truman and others in Washington, the Washington government, knew that this was going to happen. There were CIA military reports, etc., warning about this, but they kind of deliberately dismissed them or ignored them, and kind of let it happen because they thought they could possibly get the entire peninsula. And then on the other hand, as you mentioned with Stalin, he was the main at that time. Moscow was one of the main sponsors of the North, of Pyongyang, and but as I understand it, Stalin had mixed feelings about this invasion. He offered the North military equipment, but he refused any direct assistance, such as providing advisors and more direct assistance to the North. So. And the other thing that strikes me about it was that I was doing a little research this morning before speaking with you, was that
how it relates to the Korean War was the U.S.'s first major undeclared war in the constitutional sense. As I'm sure you and most of your listeners know, but just to reiterate that in the U.S. Constitution, Congress is the one who has the authority to declare war. But the Korean War was not a declared war. Congress did not officially, in the constitutional sense, declare war. And Truman kind of took it upon himself to initiate this war and get involved in this war. And it's still technically ongoing to this day. I mean, you have an armistice, but you do not have a formal peace agreement between either side. I mean, there's still, I guess, in a legal sense, perhaps not, in reality, but at least legally, they're still in a state of war. The North and the South.
And the whole setup, because you have this whole issue of the role of Russia in the Pacific theater in World War II, where, originally they were to come in after Germany surrendered, and then America didn't want them intervening, and then you had all this intrigue with General Marshall and what was really going on in China, the apparent support that Mao got from U.S. intelligence that facilitated his coming to power in 1949. And you also have in the Korean War itself, the U.S. 7th Fleet kept Taiwan from intervening. Although legally Taiwan is a member of the UN, they were part of the Security Council then, because Taiwan was officially China, and vis-a-vis the UN, because Mao wasn't recognized until the 70s under Nixon and Carter. So, but they prevented Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from intervening after the Chinese invaded. So it almost seemed like there was an attempt to draw out the conflict. And you have that odd statement by Dean Acheson, I think, in his memoirs, that said that Korea came along and saved us. Now, what he meant by that was it created a crisis for the Cold War and NATO and these things, because at the time, the domestic politics in the United States was that people were very skeptical of the Truman Doctrine and the Cold War, which was primarily a democratic program at that time. And you had a very strong, wouldn't say isolationist, because that's a pejorative term, non-interventionist, a more old right non-interventionist lobby in Congress that was very skeptical about large defense budgets, perennial defense budgets, the draft of these things. And what the Korean War did was that it reignited the draft, and it also set the stage for it overnight. Virtually overnight, it quadrupled the War Department, now the Defense Department, budget.
And it did, as you mentioned, it did sort of diminish this isolationist or non-interventionist kind of attitude amongst the American populace, which was something the government really struggled with in the 1920s and 30s. With the Washington really wanting to get involved in what became World War II, but their hands were tied because public opinion was so adamantly against it. And also in terms of joining these international institutions. I mean, it was American, again, quote unquote, isolationism that prevented Washington from being able to join with the League of Nations. So that there is this kind of, especially in Middle America, especially, there's this idea, this sort of aversion to getting involved in wars and going abroad and all this sort of stuff that's sadly become, since the Korean War, has become much more of a mainstay of American politics. And there's much more mixed feelings about it. And I think kind of the Korean War sort of set the stage for that, this notion that America is not just one nation among others, but America is the world's policeman. That I was reading some of these comments by these ranking. I can't remember his name at this time. There was a Vermont senator at the time when the Korean War was getting going, and he pointed out, or rather, he sort of stated the Washington establishment opinion that it's now the standard that peace has to exist everywhere on the globe for Americans to experience peace. So it's this idea that, okay, there's war in Korea, so that we have to get involved because somehow there has to be peace everywhere, or else America can't sleep safely anymore. So they kind of rolled out this notion that a problem anywhere in the world, it's America's problem, and America has to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And there was this Orwellian concept of perpetual peace through perpetual war.
Exactly.
And then you get the Defense Department. Since we've had when we had a War Department, we actually had times of peace. Since it's become the Defense Department, perpetual war.
Yeah, defending us from what, we wonder. Yeah.
I think it was Edward Bernays came up with that idea, changing it to the Defense Department.
Yeah, and it seems to work because that's the one government department even libertarians and conservatives seem not to want to touch or cut anything from.
Yep. And it's interesting because if you look at some of the Cold Warriors, the first Cold Warriors, people like Dean Acheson, I think his brother represented the Soviet Union in the 30s. He's the one that the Soviet Union hired to represent them, their interest section in the United States. And a lot of these Cold Warriors had these strange dealings with communists. I mean, like Dean Rusk in the 60s, a lot of the architects of the Vietnam War, also went over to the Ford Foundation, the International Policy Institute.
Even going back to guys like Alger Hiss and such. There was a lot of overlap.
And looking back at that, the McCarthy era and Whittaker Chambers and all that drama with Nixon, a lot of that was, at least in my opinion, was at a higher level stage. I think what you had in the immediate post-war setting were two different factions of the globalists. One where you could, crudely say pro-fascist Dulles wing, and the pro-Soviet Hiss wing, the a Morgenthau wing and these things. And you saw that right after World War II with the Morgenthau plan and the plan to destroy Germany, how that was sort of nipped in the bud. And it was partially implemented under Eisenhower with the Eisenhower camps, the Rhine Meadow camps, which no one seems to know about because it's not talked about, the death camps that were run by the Allied occupation authorities right after World War II. But there seemed to be, right after World War II, a decision was taken that for the Cold War, not to fend off the Red Menace, which was set up to be a menace, but for the Cold War environment, they needed a strong West Germany, and that included what that meant was ending the denazification programs and kind of going after the leftist element, the Alger Hiss wing, which is the pro-Soviet wing, and the pro-fascist, pro-Nazi Dulles wing won out, and that became the kind of the Cold War establishment in the late 40s and 50s.
Well, even coming back to the Korean Peninsula, you had the government of Rhee was one of the excuses the North used to invade the South was that Rhee was violently suppressing leftist and allegedly, quote unquote communist elements within the society.
That's right.
Mass imprisonments, executions, etc. People kind of associate South Korea now with this modernized democratic society, the K-pop and Samsung and all this kind of stuff, but they don't realize in the history how brutal the American-backed government in Seoul was up until late 80s, early 90s. I mean, there was a lot of brutality, and there were a lot of leftist elements in this society who were not communist by any means, but leftist, and they were ruthlessly dealt with by the Seoul government.
That's right, because didn't Rhee suffer a major election setback just before the invasion, or the year before? And the invasion did occasion sort of a reign of terror, where a purge was carried. He suppressed hundreds of thousands of dissidents, because of the national security threat, the invasion. But it is interesting throughout that war how it seemed to be dragged out, how MacArthur was prevented from bombing, the bridges that allowed the Chinese to pour over.
Yeah, it was as if Washington ultimately didn't want to win the war. They wanted the standstill. They wanted this kind of not defeat but not victory type situation.
Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned earlier, preventing Taiwan from intervening, despite the fact that this was a UN operation and Taiwan sat in the UN on the Security Council, yet was prevented from intervening. There was an element that wanted to win out, and maybe that factors into the longer plan of what China was to play in the New World Order. If you look at it today, China's become this factory, the workhouse for the West of cheap items, that they, and this is part of that trilateralist plan, sort of the deindustrialization of the West, this reorganizing of the global economy, and sort of the impoverishment or deindustrialization of the West, and the building up of China, which occurred, which would occur a couple of decades later in the 1970s and 80s. And that is a Rockefeller plan. And if you go back, way back, not too far back, but in the early 20th century, is the Rockefellers played a big part in supporting people like Mao. Mao was trained by that Yale Institute, that Yale Divinity School, I think, trained Mao. And so I know, although it's disconcerting for many people to think of Mao ultimately as an agent of the West, we have to look at these things in terms of dialectics. Now, Mao was necessary in China to carry out a certain process to destroy traditional China, so China could be reintroduced decades later into the New World Order as sort of this workhouse to build these manufactured goods that we all buy at Walmart now. And the same thing, you see the same thing in Korea and in Vietnam too. Even though North Vietnam won the war, they're pretty much integrated into the New World Order economy now. Yeah. So. Oh yeah,
you even had it several years ago. I remember when John McCain went to Vietnam for the first time as sort of, look, we're opening. They threw me in the jail cell for several years, but look, we're now embracing them as part of a global economic partner and stuff. So even though the government didn't technically change, but they're quite willing to embrace them. As far as China goes, I think in Mao specifically, it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about this kind of pro-Soviet, pro-communist elements in the U.S. government during World War II. I think it was the Soviet sympathizing elements that got Washington to start backing Mao's forces initially under the cover up that they would be, fighting against the Japanese occupation of China.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that. And even again, to come back to Korea, it's really hard to truly get an idea or understanding of Korean history without understanding the role that Japan, the Japanese occupation played, and going back to Theodore Roosevelt, actually, who was sort of gave the rubber stamp to the Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula back in the early 1900s. So there's a lot of sort of playing around, moving the chairs around a lot, and people kind of don't get this full sense of that. I think the media doesn't give you this. If you watch CNN, if you watch Fox, if you watch any of these kind of outlets, they don't give you this full picture, the historical roots, which make it really hard to understand it, so that when you get North Korea, you just think, oh, he's just some anti-American crazy guy. You have no context to really understand the situation one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting, because if you look at something, a situation or a country like Japan, which up until the 1850s was sort of this insular feudal society, and then the gunboat showed up with Commodore Perry, who, interestingly enough, had married into the Rothschild family through August Belmont. I think his daughter married August Belmont, who was the Rothschild agent in the United States. But the Asian trade, particularly the China trade, and that whole area with the imperialist powers, the United States getting into the game in the late 19th century. And if you look at it, it was that presence of those gunboats in Japan and in Tokyo Bay, which led to the Meiji restorations and the sort of industrialization and rapid modernization and militarization of Japanese society, which led them to become an imperialist nation in the 1890s. And they were following European models. They had Prussian advisors, American advisors in their military. The industrialization was there to create a strong economy, a strong army, so that they could stand toe to toe with the imperialist powers. But it was the United States and England that used Japan for decades in Asia. They were sort of the cat's paw.
Counter Russia with that.
Yeah, counter Russia, and it wasn't until the 1930s when Japan got too big for its britches. And I think there was one Japanese diplomat in the late, I guess it was in 1940-41, who wryly remarked that just when we learned to play poker, they changed the game to bridge.
Which they're still doing to this day.
Exactly.
Just ask Gaddafi. Oh.
Exactly. Yeah. And so Japan was set up, Korea was set up. Japan occupied Korea for like 30, 40 years, I guess.
Yeah, and actually the interesting thing is the U.S. tried to similarly open up Korea back in the 1870s and was rather unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. They even had a very small, but they had a brief military conflict with the then Korean monarchy. The U.S. was their intentions, their proclaimed intentions were that they had wanted to open economic relations with the Koreans, as well as map the coastal areas of the peninsula. But however, the Korea at that time, and it's interesting because I think North Korea has a very similar attitude, was very isolationist at the time.
Yeah.
They didn't want to deal with any foreign powers, whether they were Western or Asian. It didn't matter to them. They didn't want to deal with any outside powers. So they asked the Americans to leave. But the Americans decided, we're still going to map the coastal area. And when they got near the mouth of the major river, the Han River, which passes through Seoul and out into the Yellow Sea near China, when they got into that area, and I guess the area is now near what is the modern city of Incheon, which is, again, just directly west of Seoul, the Koreans were not impressed and started firing on the American ships. Obviously, the Americans had the technological superiority and quickly overwhelmed the Korean military forces, which were based on some island outpost near the mouth of the Han River. But the Americans were still unable to get any kind of real treaty or deal with the Koreans. I think they later got some kind of milquetoast treaty, but the Koreans were not particularly keen on dealing with the Americans. I think the Koreans had a conflict a few years earlier with the French. It actually kicked the French out. The French lost that one. But I think, so in that light of that, the Americans were only too happy to allow Japan to assume control of the peninsula, as figuring, if we can't deal with them, let someone else have them.
Mm-hmm. And then Japan tried to impose their culture on the Koreans.
Japan wanted to, I don't know what the word would, Japanize the Korean peninsula. They tried to suppress the traditional Korean culture. And on one hand, that was perhaps helpful to Korea in the long run in terms of modernizing, because it had this sort of degenerate Confucianism and this degenerate land-owning pseudo-aristocratic class that did prevent any sort of social development or technological development, and the Japanese occupation did get rid of these kind of forces, these social forces that were holding the society back. Again, this is how some Koreans at least see it. So I guess I got the silver lining in all of it. But certainly Washington, London, Paris, etc. didn't see Korea, at least up until the 1940s, they didn't see Korea as having any destiny of its own, but simply just being sort of as a satellite of Tokyo. Yeah,
and according to Fletcher Pratty, some people are different opinion of him and how reliable he is as a source. But he claimed that in 1945, a lot of the munitions that had been stockpiled for the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, they were split up. Half were sent to Korea and half were sent to Vietnam. And you do have a situation where it apparently the arms are being sent to those two areas to stoke a civil war to justify future intervention, and we certainly got that. I mean, Ho Chi Minh was supported by the West until suddenly, he was left high and dry. The French were reinstalled, and the same. You have the whole situation in Korea, where it's divided up. You're setting up the situation for a future conflict. And it's not as if these people can't look at a map and go, "Oh, this might be a problem." I mean, they're anticipating a problem, and indeed, they probably want a problem for the reasons we stated earlier. This was a justification for United Nations, unilateral, presidential power to start a war. This sort of this interventionism, the Cold War, as sort of a strategy of tension, and and of course domestically, this also coincides with the with McCarthyism. But you mentioned,
and I think it also relates to this kind of older paranoia in the West about the so-called yellow pearl. I think it's very easy. It was very easy for them. Maybe they would have a harder time in other areas, but in East Asia, it was very easy for them to quickly, not even demonize, but just present East Asians, whether it's the Koreans, the Chinese, the Vietnams, it's just this sort of collective insect society. So you're not dealing with individual people. You're just this massive, insect hive that you're
a mongrel horde.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's funny because Truman, as a boy, read serial stories in magazines like McCall's, I think, about Fu Manchu and evil Asians, and some people think that psychologically facilitated his decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I think even in the case of someone like the author Jack London, some of his, at least one of his stories had that similar kind of attitude in it.
Mm-hmm.
The title eludes me at this point, but I recall he wrote one of these stories where essentially kind of indicating, let's wipe out the yellow race as they're this insect horde that threatens us.
And you'd expect that, and a lot of other cultural programming by the powers that be that have long-term economic interests, because obviously, good example, Manifest Destiny. That whole meme was created, by, I think it was August Belmont, who was working for the Rothschilds to sort of justify this ruthless push westward in the North American continent. Manifest Destiny. In the 19th and early 20th century, you had the same things about the expansion into the Pacific Ocean, about the interest in Asia, and I think a lot of this might have been to do with the China trade, which really was opium, and that became so important in the 19th century with the clipper ships and all the important families, the people that controlled the political, that held real political power in the United States, all had ties to the opium trade, because that's China, it's Asia. Families like the Delanos, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Tafts, the Coolidges, some of the other some of the other families. Obviously, the founders of Skull and Bones. It was capitalized by the immense fortune that was raised through the opium trade, and these became sort of the Eastern Seaboard elite, the establishment, the banking families, and obviously they were to exert immense political influence in the early 20th century.
And now in our own century.
Yeah, it hasn't ended.
Well, I think you mentioned it in passing earlier about what Obama made this centerpiece of his foreign policy, the so-called pivot towards Asia.
Yeah.
And Trump, that seems to be one area where both Obama and Trump agree. Trump seems. There does seem to be a military aspect, but it seems to be much more an economic aspect, where they see China, which does seem to have been earlier sort of playing footsies with the globalists, and they want to, but China, I'm of the opinion, China tries to play both sides.
Mm-hmm.
China, does play by the globalist game, but they don't want to be subsumed into globalism. They still want to be their own kind of independent power. So they're kind of, I have mixed feelings about them. I'm not entirely. It's kind of hard to read what they're entirely up to.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, Trump has, as you know, is very anti-China. I think in some senses justifiably so, in terms of the economic stuff, where there's these trade deficiencies and unfair tariffs that are put on American goods, but that the U.S. doesn't put on Chinese goods, etc. So there is that aspect to it, but there is the geopolitical aspect as well. And it certainly seems that the U.S. doesn't want China to have any sort of unique hegemony in, for instance, the South China Sea. That's another big hot spot currently, where China has built these artificial islands to give itself some kind of military advantage. Washington's not pleased with that, as that kind of makes their reach in that region a little more difficult. And I've seen, I think the more recent thing seems to me to be the former, I guess what's the current name eludes me, Burma, Myanmar, what's they called it?
Myanmar.
Myanmar, where they're sort of now being stoked up ethnic conflicts there with the Muslim population as sort of kind of the 21st century Kosovo, because Myanmar has started to move into the Chinese orbit, and Washington is none too pleased about that. Mm-hmm. So you do have this sort of Washington has this, we hear about Atlanticism, but now you have this kind of Pacificism where Washington wants to have hegemony not just over the Atlantic, but over the Pacific regions as well. And you have this, and this is, again, a long-term program going back to when the U.S. seized the Philippines, seized Hawaii, after World War II, took control of Guam and a lot of these other South Pacific regions. So you have this sort of chain, this island chain extending from Hawaii through the South Pacific into these, if not directly controlled, at least Washington-aligned governments like in Seoul, in Tokyo, etc. So you have this, Washington has this long reach into the Pacific and into East Asia.
Yeah, people just look at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the military installation. It appeared no one stopped to think, why was there military installation in Hawaii? Why did the United States have Hawaii to begin with? How did they get Hawaii? Well, they sent, it was like these privateers. The U.S. Marines were more or less rented out to the sugar interests, so they could incorporate Hawaii into because there's a tariff, and they wanted to use Hawaii sugar to sell it in the domestic market, and they only do that by invading Hawaii and making it a territory, and the same thing with the that was a large function in Cuba too, the National City Bank, which was a Rockefeller Rothschild bank, and behind this you have all these business interests. But you mentioned China. That's interesting because, if you read Pepe Escobar and some of the other geopolitical thinkers, you have this Mackinder doctrine that seems to be still in play, because the Atlanticist powers want to prevent sort of this Eurasian condominium or unification between Russia, China, and eventually Europe. And so you have to keep the area constantly on edge with stoking the flames of civil war, ethnic unrest, using Muslim extremists as sort of a proxy soldier. Same thing they did in the Caucasus regions and in the Balkans in the 90s. So you're constantly stoking up problems. At the same time, you also want to control the sea lanes, and that way China can't have they can't establish a pan-Eurasian trade zone, because that goes towards ultimately, I guess, undermining the U.S. dollar as a world's reserve currency. Because right now, all that trade they have to engage with, they have to use U.S. dollars. At least I think 2/3 of the world trade is still in U.S. dollars, and this keeps the U.S. dollar artificially strong, despite the fact that the United States has a $20 trillion national debt and is running these huge trade deficits. So the only way to keep that going is to prevent China and Russia and trading with Europe, because if they start trading together, the odd man out are the Americans and perhaps the British.
Yeah, and not only that is China. The current Western policy is to isolate Russia, but China is their kind of stumbling block in implementing that policy, because China refuses to sanction Russia in any way, refuses to go along with any of that, and in fact has integrated much closer with Russia over the past several years. And it's sort of kind of hard. China is in the unique position where it can kind of play both sides, and the West doesn't like that very much, because they kind of have to make certain concessions to China, but at the same time, China doesn't necessarily have to make the same concessions to them. So it's kind of this odd arrangement that you have between the two parties.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, but they don't want. I mean, because obviously, you look at China. China has the factories. Russia has the natural resources, and Europe has a technical know-how. So
and yet at the same time, the Washington establishment refused the sort of economic nationalism that people like Steve Bannon were proposing, which was very I don't want to say hostile, but certainly antagonistic and skeptical of China, and wanted to sort of break free of the current economic situation where the U.S. is highly dependent on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese products. So on the one hand, they want to maintain this sort of economic relationship, but on the other hand, they want to undermine China's sort of geopolitical independence. And I don't know how they will sort of bridge the gap between these two.
Yeah, it's a difficult. I don't think you can, because I think this situation was created intentionally back in the 70s. It's a trilateral scheme, because you had, when the United States cut the closed the gold window and severed the U.S. dollar's last tie to gold, it ushered in this era of inflation and debt, because right after that it was Kissinger who negotiated this petrodollar system, and this was also factors into the the Yom Kippur War, which seemed to be fomented by the oil companies and Kissinger to cause this $400% spike in oil prices. But at the same time, if you prop up the dollar artificially, if you overvalue the dollar internationally by making it the world reserve currency, at the same time you're promoting manufacturing abroad with cheap labor, you're going to inevitably lead to the deindustrialization of the United States, because all those cheap goods are being imported, and U.S. And at that point, manufacturing is that much cheaper, and the U.S. if the U.S. just can export dollars to get those goods, you create the macroeconomic environment where ultimately the factories in the West, particularly the United States, are going to be shuttered, because again, you're using all that cheap labor in China that was created by decades and decades of civil war and communist oppression and these things. You have the same model occurring in Latin America, with this policy of destabilization. So the globalists can exploit more or less the slave labor of these areas to bring wages down, and it all goes to this ultimate plan, I think, about sort of imposing a neo-feudalistic order over the globe. So what
it goes to it goes. I guess it kind of plays into now also the current debate about this DACA stuff, because I've never seen an American politician care more about somebody residing in the U.S. than they care about these DACA kids.
Well, the Democrats want the welfare votes, and the Republicans want the cheap labor. The corporations, right? Isn't that?
But but it's just interesting that they couldn't. You could have an American veteran dying on the street, and these politicians wouldn't blink an eye, but all hell breaks loose if a single DACA kid gets deported. So it's this same kind of, I guess, attitude that they have I guess the most charitable reading you could say is they have utter indifference towards their fellow citizens, especially if they're in the working class, and increasingly even in the middle class. But some low skill laborer from Mexico is elevated to sainthood by the economic establishment in Washington there, and it's the same thing and with on the international scale, where you see all this praising of Vietnam or China or some of these other Southeast Asians for their embracing neoliberal economics, and on the other hand, they spit on the average Trump supporter for being a backward, hateful bigot who doesn't keep up with the modern times and should just, even though he lost his factory job, he should just shut up and put up, essentially, is the attitude they have.
Yeah, the job is going away. Retrain, do something else, as I think it was Bill Kristol said that. Stop whining.
Yeah, stop whining, as if Bill Kristol's ever had to work a day in his life.
I know. A good example, I think, here's the new economy. New economy in Pennsylvania, there was a old Bethlehem steel factory. They were shut down. And Sheldon Adelson went in and built and converted it to a casino.
Well, there you go.
That's the new economy.
Yeah,
you take more money out. Yeah, it's like,
yeah, they say these guys. Yeah, you said it there. They need to be retrained, but retrained for what? You can't work even in a call center anymore because that's subcontracted out to some group in India. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no, unless you're going to be in some high tech profession, which is not something most people, especially somebody who's been working in a factory for the past 20 or 30 years, that's not something most people are going to be able to be trained for or adapt to. So
no.
It shows the utter kind of elitism and snobbery of these guys in New York and Washington who just kind of, just go get trained for a new job. I mean, they're completely out of touch with the reality because of course guys like Bill Kristol, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, so he's never had to do anything. And even though his awful little Weekly Standard doesn't even make any money, he's got Rupert Murdoch to bail him out at the end of the day anyways. So he's not worried about losing his job anyways. So. No.
And again, this this isn't even laissez-faire because, as I think we've pointed out in the past, is what these globalists, these oligarchs are doing. People like Sheldon Adelson and George Soros, is they're exploiting the conditions in these countries. In fact, they go a long way in creating the conditions.
Yeah, that's what I say. They create the conditions. Yeah, so it's not something that just sort of naturally developed over time. It's something that's been artificially created and promoted and pushed by these same people who then they take your job and then tell you, put up and shut up if you don't like it, as if it's your fault or as if you had some kind of choice in it, which the average working class person doesn't. And then when the working class decides to actually say something or do something about it, even if it is in some kind of impotent way of supporting someone like Trump or Bernie Sanders, they get talked down to or scorned by the media, by the pro, the Jeb Bush Hillary wing of the establishment.
Yeah, the angry white man.
Yeah, as if you're supposed to be happy that you lost your job. I don't know what they're expecting the attitude these people should have, but.
Or you live in a like in a relatively small town in Vermont, and all of a sudden the federal government dumps 1,000 Somalis.
Oh yeah, and again, and not just dumps them there, but then puts them on government welfare, state welfare and all this stuff too. So you're not only there's no jobs in your town and these people are being dumped in it, but you have to also subsidize them as well. Even though you yourself will be denied access to the same social services that these people will be getting.
There's definitely malevolence in this. This isn't stupidity. I mean, obviously this is demographic warfare being conducted by NGOs and government institutions. I mean, if you do the research in this, I mean.
Well, and I think Steve Bannon pointed this out most recently in his 60 Minutes interview. The former Trump campaign manager, what was his position? I forget what his exact position was in the White House, but Steve Bannon pointed out in his 60 Minutes interview when he was criticizing the American Bishops' Conference, who are very pro-open borders, with Bannon himself being a devout Catholic. The Bishops' Conference is very pro-open borders, and the reason for that is not just because they want to, one of the reasons they want to fill their pews with Mexicans and Latin Americans, which, considering that they're losing a lot of members over the past since the end of since Vatican II came into implementation, but also they receive a lot of federal money to, quote unquote, resettle these refugees. So it's a big business, whether it's the Catholics, the Lutherans, or even the secular NGOs, that they receive a lot of federal money to resettle these Somalis and all these others who are not here as, even as low-skilled workers, because they're not even working a lot of times. They're just going on the state welfare, and the bishops think that, this is God's work. Christ came into the world just as to be a community organizer or something, something like that. Yeah.
Handing out EBT cards and get out the vote dryers, EBT cards. Yeah. And people I think they know they're doing this, but the average person doesn't realize. The average, I think, person who liberal or left of center doesn't realize just how disruptive that these can be to local communities when you're bringing in people of a foreign language, different culture, and suddenly the area is inundated, and overnight, the whole area changes complexion, and this is social engineering.
And not only that, these are people who, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism, but just sort of as an objective observation, who have radically different values, social values, cultural values, than your average American. And they're not being told that they have to sort of leave behind their previous cultural institutions and stuff and adapt to the new ones. No, the American is told he has to sort of put his values and his cultural principles on hold and tolerate or accept or increasingly embrace and celebrate what many Americans might view, for better or for worse, but might view as rather savage and uncivilized cultural habits of some of these people.
Yeah, and you have a situation, I think it's the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, where there's been a transplanted Somali community. And now there's a problem with crime because these people are a lot of on welfare. They don't blend into the culture, and they themselves are alienated from the host culture. And the malls there have a problem now with crime, people hanging out. They're completely different from the other people, and you're destroying any sense of community. And
and not only that, these Somali communities in Minnesota have actually been one of the main sources within the United States for these jihadi pipelines to Syria and Somalia for IS and Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda and some of these other groups.
I'm sure that wasn't anticipated.
Yeah, just a coincidence, I'm sure.
It's like, and that's another. It's probably a good segue, and we're talking about some of the domestic tensions here in the United States. The events a few weeks ago in Charlottesville. And the sort of yet another war on the South and Southern culture, and this spasm of iconoclasm taking on these statues. Obviously, it was going to spark a reaction. What's your take on what's going? I mean, obviously, you've probably, although you're way over there in South Korea, you've probably followed some of the events here. This emphasis on slavery and the Civil War, the so-called Civil War in the South, and this new assault on Southern culture.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's being tied to Charlottesville, but it seems to me it started a little bit earlier, maybe 2 or 3 years ago with this, what's his name? The guy who went and shot, Roof, yeah, the Roof guy who went and shot up the church, and then that was kind of used to start this process of removing Confederate flags from various public places. And
somehow the Confederate flag was implicated.
Yeah, and even tech groups like Amazon and stuff got into it, of refusing to sell Confederate flags on their website and stuff. So I think that kind of set the stage, and I'm guessing it was something that was sort of sitting there on ice, waiting for a Dylan Roof to give them an excuse to roll it out. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of a simmering issue, I think, that Charlottesville again sort of gave them a second burst of energy to do this culture ISIS Taliban style destruction of statues and public memorials and stuff. The people who are doing this, I don't think they're from these communities half the time, as I understand it.
Yeah, they're bussed in.
Bussed in.
Given $50 by George Soros or something.
Yeah, Soros, or even just your average dumb college student who would eagerly do this for free because they think it's some moral, virtuous thing to do.
Yeah,
the virtue signaling. Yeah,
they're the freedom riders.
No, yeah, exactly. This civil rights thing is the sort of the civic religion in the U.S. at this point.
Yeah.
Rationally, I would think, okay, if these statues are such a controversial thing in these communities, put it to some kind of public referendum. Let the communities decide and vote if they want to keep or don't keep it. It shouldn't be something that the country as a whole should be concerned about. That would be my attitude. That would be, I think, a rational, simple way to deal with it. If the community votes it out, okay, it's out. If they want to keep it, they keep it. It's none of my business. I don't care one way or the other. But especially in the sort of the age of Trump, I think the media needs to keep up these constant tensions, keep the population divided on edge, and they're always looking for something to club Trump with. So after Charlottesville, Trump, made what I thought was a pretty reasonable, statement responding about the situation. But no, it wasn't good enough for them. So,
my own thing is, I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't vote, but
yeah, I didn't either. I didn't vote. Yeah.
But so I'm not a fan of Trump. I hate his enemies. If he has any whatever he represents, I do represent. A lot of people voted for him. Is this reaction to this globalist globalist order that's being imposed, sort of a revival of nationalism, these things. But what he said at that press conference was refreshingly reasonable to hear a politician saying those things.
Yeah, and you note that they didn't really factually have anything against him. It's just it's all ideological opposition. He didn't say the right party line, and again, I didn't vote for Trump. I've supported some of his policies. Verbally, I guess I would describe myself at best as kind of anti-Trump.
Yeah.
As bad as he is, his enemies are much worse, much worse.
Yeah.
And again, he made a completely reasonable statement. I think, had he said it in kind of earlier time, a decade ago, it wouldn't have been that controversial. But because the media has to keep this tension going, they can't give Trump any ground. They can't concede anything to him. So everything has to be a wedge issue. Everything has to be riled up. And these awful Antifa guys, have been encouraged by the media, have been encouraged by the Democratic Party, and more recently have been given cover by people like Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and some of the other Republican establishment figures who have said, you can't compare Antifa to the alt-right or to the neo-Nazis. There's no moral equivalency. And I would agree, because I think the Antifa guys are a lot worse than the these kind of lumpen prole three-man group, clans groups who are kind of nothing in terms of their social impact.
Well, you had this event in Charlottesville where you have a planned event. They had the permit to give speeches. People are going to show up, and then these people are bussed in or they arrive, and they disrupt it, and then they're treated as equal footing as the people who tried to organize the demonstration, which was legal. And the police did nothing to protect their rights, for public demonstration, for free speech.
Yeah, in fact, they were told to stand down, as I understand.
Yeah, and so basically, if someone's giving you a speech you don't like, you can disrupt it just by acting like a hooligan, and the law will treat you the same as the people who had a right to be there to begin with. And in situations like Charlottesville, you have this carpetbag government. I think the mayor's from New York City. He's a Jewish guy from New York City or something. So they have no regard.
He's not a native Southerner.
They have no regard for Southern culture, and that's a liberal town. It's a university town. The South is pockmarked with those areas around universities. It's always the liberals that live in little bastions around the universities, and they can't stand the locals. The primitive locals, and that's a typical Yankee view of the South. And I'm not even from the South. I'm just saying. I mean, technically, I'm born in Florida, but I'm saying, but I wasn't raised there. I mean, culturally, I'm not a Southerner. But ironically, I think it was General Lee's military maneuvers that prevented Charlottesville from being burned by the Yankees. But they have no regard for that because this whole slavery thing. The South is just irredeemably evil and primitive because of slavery. Slavery is the ultimate evil, and I do think this talk of slavery now and this the Confederacy is an attempt to create sort of this cartoonish portrayal of the South and slavery in particular. The type of Alex Haley, Roots, Quentin Tarantino version of slavery. That's what most people have. They don't look at the complex nature of the peculiar institution, the Southern culture. It didn't define the South; it was just part of the South.
And they don't even know about the sort of Northern attitudes about these things at the time.
Yeah,
I mean, someone like Abraham Lincoln was not an anti-racist.
Don't you know that song from the '60s? Yeah. Anyone here is my old friend John, Abraham Martin and John. Lincoln on several occasions had, in his earlier political career, had mentioned how he would like to have seen blacks, repatriated back to Africa. Mm-hmm. He himself confessed that, his main goal, whether you agree with it or not in hindsight, but his main goal was to preserve the Union. Mm-hmm. And he said that if he had to keep slavery to preserve the Union, he would do that. He would be willing to do that. I mean, that was his fundamental goal, was preserving. He was, this kind of big country nationalist type. I mean, he wasn't civil rights marcher or something like that. And a lot of even a lot of the abolitionist types, putting aside like guys like Garrison and some of the more liberal types, but a lot of them they didn't want blacks mixing with whites. They didn't want blacks in the country. Mm-hmm. So their opposition to the expansion of slavery wasn't, maybe they didn't like slavery. But it wasn't about slavery per se, but they didn't want non-whites in their country, in their communities, even whether they were slaves or freemen. It didn't matter to them. They just didn't want them there. Yeah, and also this portrayal of slavery as the ultimate evil is not putting it in its context at the times. It was unjust. I'm not saying it was just or right, but let's not. Do we have to give in to childish, cartoonish, propaganda? Much of what we understand as slavery institution is seen through the lens of Yankee propaganda, and you have to acknowledge that. And although there's brutality in these things involved in slavery, but the reality is, it's difficult for people to face this, is that the living standards of the typical slave in the South was better than living standards of the factory worker in the North. The diet was better, life expectancy was longer. Isn't justifying slavery, but that's just the reality.
And not only that, my approach from a realist perspective, historical perspective, is that slavery is an institution that's been around for a long, long, long time. The American South didn't invent the institution, and they weren't the last ones to practice it either. No. So, I mean, if you kind of look at it from that perspective, yes, I would agree that it's an evil institution, and it should have been and was rightly abolished, mm-hmm. Whatever the circumstances that led to it being abolished. But in and of itself, it was right to be abolished. But, treating it as if it's this unique, almost metaphysical evil committed by the white Southerner, as if no one else in human history, or as if no non-white civilizations have ever practiced it, or in some cases still practice it,
Yes.
is utterly ahistorical, and it's only a selfish Eurocentric white liberal could even conceive of such a thing.
And it's the evil. It is evil, not just because you're violating someone's basic natural rights as a human being, but it's also evil because it's assumed that you're treating someone in an inhumane fashion, brutalizing them. And there are other ways of doing that outside chattel slavery that go on every day in this country today. That's done through the economic system, through usury, debt, finance as a weapon. And part of the reason why they want to emphasize America's experience in chattel slavery of 140 years ago is to distract from today's slavery, debt slavery, economic exploitation that's occurring. And so, I mean, it's like, look how good we are because they were so bad back then.
Well, and not only that, how many of these Antifa thugs who were tearing down statues of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, how many of them are carrying around iPhones which were made by Chinese factory workers who live in far worse conditions than any African slave did in Alabama or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was a quote about, about the controlling of labor, how it was decided that no longer would labor be controlled by overt force. It would be controlled through finance and capital. And there's ways that you can do that. If you have, the governmental power behind you, you can manipulate the currency, you can manipulate macroeconomic policy, in ways that will narrow people's economic opportunities and choices that appear that the person is simply making a voluntary choice, but because decisions have been taken at the higher level to deny people's employment opportunities, to debase their currency, to send them into debt, you are indirectly enslaving them. And this is done intentionally. I mean, I cite, it was Henry Kissinger's National Security Study Memorandum in 1974 as NSSM 200, where he openly talked about the immiseration and the impoverishment of the Third World through war, through high energy prices, to not only to exploit their labor, to get a hold of their resources and also exploit their labor, but also to diminish their numbers, to increase the death rate. And we're supposed to think that somehow Henry Kissinger is more respected than, say, Jefferson Davis, who never,
Well, that's the other thing is we see Hillary Clinton, for example, being elevated to some sort of political sainthood by her followers and by the media establishment, etc. I mean, she's been involved directly or indirectly with how many wars, how many non-white people were killed in Iraq or in Libya or in any of the other wars that she was at least, if not directly, then at least indirectly supportive of, so there seems to be this huge, a lot of hypocrisy, willful hypocrisy, I think, on the part of the American left, which is gnashing its teeth over these, statues, which are at this point mere historical artifacts. They have no real political impact or influence, but these same leftists will turn around and support people like Hillary Clinton, like Barack Obama, and others who have been in our own times actively bombing, killing, murdering non-white people, and these same leftists, kind of have nothing really to say about it, have no moral outrage over it. It's all about appearances. If you say something racist, that's horrible. You're going to lose your job. You're going to be banned from social media, like the Daily Stormer guy who, again, I don't approve of what he said, but how he was treated was horrendous. But on the other hand, these people, you mentioned Kissinger, Clinton, all these people who have actively murdered tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of non-white people, they're going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. They're going to get lionized by the media like Hillary Clinton is for writing her book about how everyone's to blame for her defeat but herself.
Yeah.
This woman can go on TV and laugh about Muammar Gaddafi being sodomized and murdered by jihadis, and nobody blinks an eye at that. I mean, it's the double standards here are not just double standards, but the fact that it's all about it's about what you say, not what you do, that gets you, punished in our society. So if she talks about anti-racism, if she talks about diversity and tolerance, blah, 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 she can then go and kill non-white people. That's fine, but because she said the right things. She played all the right notes. So what she actually does in substance doesn't really matter. And if you kind of point that out, you're a sexist, you're an apologist for dictatorships or whatever the excuses are to avoid directly addressing those things.
Yeah. And who's killed more people, Richard Spencer or Hillary Clinton?
Exactly.
And I don't say as a supporter of Richard Spencer. I'm just pointing out who's killed more people.
Well, I was thinking about that earlier. Is as far as I'm not part of the alt-right. I'm on friendly terms with some people involved in it, but I don't consider myself alt-right, and I have a lot of criticisms of some of their both beliefs and their methods. But Richard Spencer, to his credit, and some of those other people in his circle, they've been actively opposed to some of these imperial projects of the U.S. government, even some of the ones Trump has sort of dabbled in. They're the ones who have come out and said, we don't want to bomb Syria. We're against attacking Syria. We don't want to see these troop increases in Afghanistan. We want to get out of Afghanistan. We don't want to bomb North Korea. I think they had the headline, one of the alt-right writers wrote the headline, clever headline, Kim Jong-un never called me Goyim. Sort of a play on Muhammad Ali's opposition to the Vietnamese War. So like they're the ones who are, to their credit, and I try to give people credit where credit's due, that have been opposed to bombing non-white people, who have been opposed to these imperialist projects and crusades and wars in the Middle East or in Asia, whereas the virtue signaling, supposedly anti-racist liberals cheered on Trump when he dropped the bomb on that Syrian airbase a few months ago. So, and I see some of them cheering on, Trump's going to keep the war going in Afghanistan to what? Keep carpet bombing poor Afghan shepherds in the mountain? Like, I don't know what the point of that war is at this point.
I think it's the poppy fields.
Yeah. I mean, I do know, but I mean, as it's publicly presented, I don't see what the point is.
The fact they'd be tolerant. I think the average American sit back and, okay, we're in Afghanistan. It's been, 16 years almost? 16, yeah. I mean, we're approaching, for me, tomorrow will be the anniversary of 9/11. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to mention anything about that, but we're sitting here now approaching the 16th anniversary of 9/11, and still in Afghanistan for what? Like, what's the point? Bin Laden is, insofar as he existed, that project is dead. Mullah Omar is allegedly dead. The supposed masterminds of 9/11, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they're in Guantanamo Bay. So what are we doing now? What's the point?
There's
What's
ISIS.
going on?
ISIS.
Yeah. And even ISIS is, I mean, well, according to Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, ISIS is better than Bashar al-Assad. So.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Although I think even now at this point, the ISIS project seems to be on its last leg.
They'll come up with something.
Yeah, they will. But at least in this phase, I think Robert Fisk of The Independent had an article pretty much proclaiming, rightfully proclaiming the death of ISIS, at least in Syria and Iraq.
Think about all the lives that have been. I mean, people have been murdered. The lives have been disrupted, and I mean the internal refugees in that country, the cities have been destroyed. These ancient cities, destruction of Western culture. I mean, these things, you can be like Damascus. I mean, you hear about that in the Bible, and it's being torn apart by civil war, and the migration crisis into Europe. You hear the same nonsense of how it's Europe's burden to take in these people. You know, the German Prime Minister Merkel doing her bidding, and then you have everyone's talking about you have to destroy. It's time for Europe to stop, having this I think it was Wesley Clark, and also that guy from Goldman Sachs, Sutherland, who said that you have to end these ethno states.
Yeah. All for what? Yeah.
For what? Well, I think I suspect I know.
But just again, returning, because I think you kind of have to mention this just to sort of get to normal people. Like, these things are presented a certain way publicly, and once you get them to question what was this all for, maybe they can start looking towards the more nefarious alternative explanation.
Yeah, it changes their analytical approach, and the first thing that CNN or Fox News or the networks aren't going to give you a distilled view of these things that's going to give you a clear picture of what's going on. At least it's obviously there's all types of scheming and intriguing, and the real reasons. It's like a good example, Libya. I mean, for Pete's sake. I mean, and now we know from the WikiLeaks that it was
Hillary's email.
Eyeing Gaddafi's gold hoard, and she was acting as an agent for somebody.
Yeah, Sarkozy and Clinton and the rest. They wanted to get access to because Gaddafi wanted to switch, to the sort of gold standard and this I guess you could say economic independence from the Western models. And it's funny because I think this one relates back to North Korea now. Is somebody like Gaddafi, he went along with what they asked him. They said, give up your weapons programs and we'll integrate you into the sort of global order, global society. You'll be, you'll just be another leader among leaders. We'll stop kind of giving you the hard time and punishing you. So he went along with it. He did everything they asked of him. He handed over these two Libyan agents who I think were not responsible for the Lockerbie bombings. He paid out all this money to the Lockerbie bombing victims. Again, I don't think Libya was responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. But nevertheless, he went along, he did what he's asked, and a few years later, he's being dragged through the street by U.S.-backed jihadis and murdered. So if you're, to relate it back to North Korea, if you're Kim Jong-un and you saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, you saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, you saw what is happening to a weakened Bashar al-Assad, what are you going to do in that situation? Are you just going to roll over, or are you going to try to make yourself look as unattackable as possible?
Yeah. I mean, so give up my nukes? Are you crazy?
Yeah. so I can get dragged through the street by a mob, like that's. So in that sense, I think Washington has incentivized Kim Jong-un to act in this very belligerent manner by overthrowing these governments who kind of played along, who did make the deals, who did give up their programs and try to concede to what the West wanted, and only to end up hung like Saddam Hussein was, or beaten to death by a mob like Gaddafi was. So
and what people forget is I think it was the early phase of the war on terror where Assad's regime was used to torture people by the
Oh yeah, that's the other thing is that the West was only they complain about Syria and human rights, but they were only too happy to turn over alleged and not even real Al Qaeda people. I mean, I remember there was the Canadian Syrian guy,
Omar Arar or something.
Maher Arar or something like that.
They made a movie about it.
Yeah, and who they dumped in Syria, and the U.S. told them,
Rendition,
beat this guy up and see what he says. And the U.S. was only too happy to do that. But all of a sudden now, and even you had, shortly before the thaw revolution in Syria, you had Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, all the rest of them making their pilgrimage to Damascus to meet with Assad and praise Assad as this modern leader, this model for the Arab world. But then they, when push came to shove and Assad wasn't, again, he was too close to Russia, he's too close to Iran, he's not playing by the West standards, Israel doesn't like him, so, on the flip of a hat, they turn on him and all this disaster, they destroyed, not just Syria, but they, all this disaster brought to Iraq because of it, to some of the neighboring countries, instability in Lebanon, Turkey, and all for what? Because, again, as you said, we know the ultimate real reasons, but just publicly, all for what?
Yeah, and who was the guy? The Libyan fighting group, the Islamic fighting group? Who was either Garcia or Indonesia? Who was tortured. Yeah, he was a jihadi. Then he flipped and he became the leader of the Libyan fighting group that helped overthrow.
Yeah, and there's an actual picture of him meeting with Lindsey Graham and John McCain. I forget. I know exactly what you're talking about. I can't recall his name, but yeah, he was like captured in Thailand or something and renditioned somewhere, and real nasty guy. And now he's a hero and a freedom fighter, and getting to meet John McCain, who pretty much loves anybody who will kill any government that's too close to Russia. That's his big thing.
Well, I mean, that's the sort of this. These contradictions. I mean, remember back in the '80s, the pictures of these Islamic radicals or Mujahideen meeting with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office, and you can see those old photographs, because they were the freedom fighters then, and then the Soviet-Afghan war ends in the late '80s, and then in the '90s, that's where Osama bin Laden goes, and of course, that whole network with the BCCI bank and the heroin trade, and the idea that apparently it was through the Afghan war that the United States winked and nodded at the Pakistanis' nuclear program, because they were helping us in the Afghan war, which is also too was funded a lot by heroin.
and not only that, A.Q. Khan seemed to get a lot of kind of subtle Western help to, help nudge himself along.
That goes to the idea that I interviewed the Collins brothers about that, and how actually there are elements within the West that want to promote proliferation just to destabilize the world and sort of create a climate of fear. It's all kind of controlled and managed. It's not just incompetence. It's almost like there's a pro-proliferation element that wants to create that sort of a global strategy of tension.
And specifically in the case of Pakistan, I mean, the ISI has been historically, essentially a wing of American and British intelligence.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the Islamic fighters would go west in the 90s into the Balkans, and then late 90s and 2000 the Caucasus to destabilize Russia. Chechnya and
Dagestan and all these.
Dagestan, and of course, with the Boston bombing, we were told that there was these two Chechens who carried it out. Which I don't know about you, I'm very skeptical of that story.
But even taken at face value, it's one that sort of these were guys who were affiliated with people the U.S. had been indulging for years, and had, the Russians warned about them, but somehow it's Russia's fault that the Boston bombings happened. It
just doesn't make any sense. And then why would Chechens bomb the U.S.? It doesn't, if they're Chechen radicals, and we're I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Just you remember who's that guy? CNN, that CIA guy, Bob Baer.
He's a real terrible guy.
He's a real piece of work. But what he can be very blunt sometimes. And what his job was, and he talked about how in the 90s his job was to go about the former Yugoslavia and just stir up trouble, create massacres, create rumors of massacres, and just to destroy the country.
Even more recently, I don't know if you recall. I mean, at this point, I think most people have forgotten about him. But last year during the presidential elections, you had this third-party candidate, Evan McMullin.
Oh, yeah.
quote unquote former CIA agent. He bragged that his job was to go to Syria and try to flip Al Qaeda people to work for the U.S. Not change their ideology, but just keep doing what you're doing, but just do it for us. Like this kind of thing. So it's still going on now. What Baer did then, what McMullen is doing now, or at least fairly recent.
Yeah, and it's probably occurred here domestically because if you're familiar with things like PATCON and how it played into the Oklahoma City bombing, how some of these supposed Aryan Nation and the Order, these things are fully infiltrated by federal agents, and either if they develop organically, they're quickly taken over by federal agents.
And this would be the thing that I would, to return to the alt-right, this would be the thing I'd warn those guys about.
Yes.
Because they're kind of in danger. There's already certain personalities in their orbit that I'm highly suspicious of being, I'm not going to say any names for, I guess, slander reasons, but there are certain, let's just say there are people I highly suspect of being in the employ of one, U.S. government agency or another.
Or you have to be naive, or either they're working for ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which are just, and Southern Poverty Law Center has no black people working for them, by the way.
Do they have any non-Jewish people working?
I don't think so. But that goes back to the Jewish war in the South, which goes back to
Morris Dees and these guys.
The murder of Mary Fagan, which is a very interesting story. The motivations of the organized Jewry against the South, and
well, that's interesting because I recall seeing an article maybe about a week ago. There's a statue of a member of somewhere in the Confederate government who was actually Jewish, and his statue has not come under any kind of criticism.
Judah T. Benjamin?
I don't recall the name. I think it's in Florida. But the individual in question, whose statue is up, he's of Jewish heritage origin, and that one has not. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the ADL have not been targeting his statue, but kind of putting all this focus on the predominantly Gentile members of the Confederacy.
Yeah, of course, there's Albert Pike's in Washington D.C.
Oh yeah, they won't remove that one either.
Well, that's a Freemasonic thing. But the Mary Fagan story is interesting because the Jewish guy Leo Frank, who raped and murdered her, was a member of B'nai B'rith. He was a high-ranking Jewish Freemason, and he tried to cover up the murder and tried to frame two black men in the process. He was convicted and sentenced to hang, but then the governor, who was bribed by Jewish interest, commuted the sentence, and then a mob formed and they lynched him out in front of Mary Fagan's house. And it was that trial which put the South in the sights of a lot of Jewish groups. It wasn't so much he was Jewish, perhaps, it was because he was a member of B'nai B'rith, and it was a Freemasonic thing, kind of a Jewish Freemasonry type thing, where he was more or less he needed to be protected.
Yeah, he was one of their own.
One of their own, and that started the beginning. In fact, the ADL grew out of that case. The ADL was a creation of that case because they wanted to. ADL was created to slander the South for being anti-Semitic, although there was no anti-Semitism in the South prior to that. Anti-Semitism, as whatever that means, was a reaction to the slander that the South received because of the Leo Frank trial, and that would reverberate throughout history because Jews would play a big role in promoting people like Martin Luther King, Stanley Levinson, and although they took a progressive stance, again, this idea of civil rights and integration was weaponized both in the North and the South for various political reasons. That's one thing that most people have a hard time understanding, is that even ideas that sound superficially just can be weaponized, and misused. So,
well, as far as the Civil War goes, with so-called anti-Semitism, wasn't it General Grant who ordered Jews expelled from certain areas of Tennessee and stuff like that, which he kind of later had to, as sort of a foreshadowing of what to come, he had to grovel and apologize for that later as president. But
yes, about the church.
certainly was. So it certainly wasn't the South who was this anti-Semitic proto-Nazi force, which, and that's the thing now with these things. It's like sort of the Confederacy and German National Socialism get kind of conflated into this one entity, maybe historically they're two separate things, but spiritually or metaphysically they're kind of manifestations of the same nefarious forces.
Yeah, like didn't Dylan Storm Roof have like a South African flag, a Nazi flag?
Or Rhodesia or something. Yeah.
I mean, so, I mean, it's, but yeah, you're right. Going back to the point is you have to understand that these groups can be infiltrated. I'm reading a very interesting book by Wendy Painting. It's called The Aberration of Heartland. The Lives of Timothy McVeigh. The Lives of Timothy McVeigh. And it's a very, very interesting book because it gets into the whole cultural milieu that Timothy McVeigh developed in of the 90s. The Gulf War, his disillusionment, and also it also entertains the theory that he was indeed a federal agent, an informant after the Gulf War. From what I understand, she's going back. She treats it kind of like as a crazy conspiracy theory. Then she gets in the evidence justifying the theory as being not so outlandish. One thing is this whole policy of the military, the low intensity warfare, which is kind of psychological warfare, infiltration of these groups, these various secretive military organizations that infiltrate radical groups in the name of the drug war, fighting terrorism, radicalism. How these organizations, these agents go in and they try to stoke up trouble. Agent provocateur stuff that we're all familiar with in the 60s. It was happening in the 90s. Groups like the Order, and how the FBI would nurture these groups, get them violent, and like we're seeing today with all these terrorist groups with Trevor Harrison's book Terror Factory, how a lot of these arrest of terrorist groups are FBI sting operations, plots that never would exist if not for the FBI nurturing them.
Especially nowadays with the Muslim groups.
Yeah. Well, back then it was this militia movement, which was completely infiltrated by very infiltrated by federal agents to try to radicalize them. At the same time, federal government agents overstepping. They're overstepping, violating the law in many cases, and radicalizing the group. Then using that radicalization as justification for bigger budgets. That's what occurred in PatCon when you had the Ruby Ridge incident. That the FBI carried out with military help. Where they massacre.
Where they tried to get Randy Weaver with that sawed-off shotgun.
Yeah, and you hear the case where they gave him a court date with the wrong date on so they could arrest them, and as a pretext they wanted to get him to inform on this group, the Order. He wouldn't do it. He would just go to meetings. He wasn't really a member. He just wanted to be left alone. But this precipitated this assault, the siege of the compound, which was like a cabin. They called it a compound. The media called it a compound.
Yeah, that's when I think Patrick Henningsen pointed out that he had a talk once about the use of that word, the compound.
Yeah. But the agents surrounded the place, ended up shooting the dog, and the son shot a warning shot. Then they shot the 10-year-old boy in the back, and then he also shot his wife in the head while she was holding a baby. And, it was kind of well known. It's kind of like the Waco incident, too. But within the FBI, I'm reading about it. She writes about how the people who are running this operation, Larry Potts and the FBI and the so-called hostage rescue team, and there were no hostages, by the way. But they exploited Ruby Ridge because they realized that although they had overstepped their bounds and precipitated a massacre, they realized that would cause a reaction within these militia movements, within the Aryan Nation, these white nationalist movements, that would justify more funding for PatCon. Although PatCon created the whole thing to begin with, Patriot conspiracy. See how the logic there?
Yeah. You make the problem
reaction solution, right?
Then offer the solution.
And reading it, you're like, what the? But it works. It keeps working for them.
And this is the sort of stuff I think these alt-right guys need to be reading into and looking into, because I think the 2000s it was the Muslims set them up, make these fake Al-Qaeda or ISIS cells, but we're kind of transitioning away from that, I think, and the alt-right is sort of developing into this bogeyman type type entity, and I think these guys are the next sort of guys that are going to be in the position where this sort of stuff happens. And I would advise them, get ready, be educated about this stuff so that you can avoid the mistakes that other past groups fell into.
Mm-hmm. And there's some with Antifa, how they're going to be marginalized. There was an article right there how now the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post are running articles critical of Antifa, and what this is doing is creating an environment that's intolerant towards public dissent. They're delegitimizing dissent by radicalizing, creating a violent environment.
Yeah, they're sort of creating this situation where the only acceptable opinions are, I think Tom Woods said, between Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
And if you fall out too far to the left, too far to the right, you're going to be first. You're going to come to come to someone's attention, and depending on how vulnerable you are or how prominent you are, you might be the target for some of this agent provocateur stuff or some other kind of setups. And it's much easier now to set people up in the age of the internet with all this technology. And also I've even seen, just on the left-hand side, I've seen, so we see how Bernie Sanders, the Clinton people, I've seen how they kind of marginalize, not Bernie Sanders per se, but his kind of ardent followers, the so-called Bernie bros and stuff, how they're being sort of cast as these political extremists who destabilize the democratic centrist order. And then on the right you have the alt-right, you have even the so-called alt-light people have been the ADL ran a list a few weeks ago, and you expect to see Richard Spencer and those guys on it, but they even had characters who are pretty pro-Zionist, like Mike Cernovich and some of these other rather what I would say kind of milquetoast type figures. But even that's outside the range of acceptable opinion. So if you're out there on that wing of things, you're kind of going to set yourself up for somebody like Cernovich. I don't think personally is going to be targeted beyond media smears, but a lot of these young men who don't really understand how the world works, who don't understand what's really going on, who have a lot of this kind of anger and energy, I can see a lot of them getting swept up and taken advantage of to delegitimize any kind of resistance or criticism or critique of the system.
Yeah. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. I thought it was interesting because I ran across an article today regarding Obamacare, and it goes, Obamacare architect flip-flops on single payer. The time has come. So those who said Obamacare was kind of a stalking horse for single-payer socialized medicine, I guess, were right. Because Senator Max Baucus, you remember it was Max Baucus who supposedly wrote the law, but the person who really wrote the law was this lady, Elizabeth Fowler, who was kind of like the vice president for WellPoint, an insurance company. Then she left private enterprise for government service to write the law. At this point, is there any difference between so-called private enterprise and the government? There is, as if the insurance industry is private enterprise. They put a gun to my head and tell me to buy it. But I guess it's kind of funny because, look at the U.S., we have a $20 trillion federal deficit, he says, here we go. It goes, in the summer of 2009, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont was asked if Max Baucus, the Democratic chairman of the powerful Senate Finance Committee, who was taking the lead on health care reform at the time, was open to his ideas, to a single-payer idea. Not in a million years, Sanders replied to a C-SPAN interviewer. Now I guess Max Baucus is flipped. He says, I just think the time has come. Max Baucus told NBC News Friday, after stunning healthcare observers early in the day by seemingly coming around on a single payer on a public forum. Back in 2009, we were not ready to address it. It would never have been passed. Oh, really? That's great. So you're acknowledging the Fabian approach, I guess. Here we are 9 years later, and I think the time has hopefully has come at a very serious good faith look at it. Baucus's evolution reflects how quickly once fringe idea of government-funded healthcare is gaining traction inside the Democratic Party. On Wednesday, Sanders, the issue's most vocal champion, who will roll out a long-anticipated bill detailing his plan provide Medicare for all, as advocates prefer to call it. Medicare, it's already what? I guess it's perfectly sound and funded, so that's a good idea to give it to everybody, right? So it's like more socialism. Why not?
But on the other hand, you have the Republicans who've sort of seemed to have embraced Obamacare now.
Yes, now that's the moderate position.
Yeah, they had they've had 7 years to come up with a plan to repeal and replace, but they couldn't put anything together, even though they have majorities in both houses, as well as a president who would sign whatever they gave him, probably, and they can't, because they're kind of comfortable with it now. And I've seen, the conservative publications have started to slowly warm up to it, and no, we can't have full repeal. That would be terrible. We got the system now, and just tweak with it a little bit, and that's all they really care to do. I mean, they're not interested in the full repeal anymore. Yeah,
and it was on Wednesday. Here, Baucus compared the issue's evolution to that of gay rights. It's an anathema for a long time, and then suddenly acceptance. Well, it wasn't acceptance. You're talking about 50 years of a sexual revolution of psychological warfare. It wasn't like overnight. Well, TV, propaganda. What are you talking about? Overnight.
Well, it's, so-called evolving on a political issue is similar to like the compound word. It's just one of these words to mask the reality of the situation. So, everyone is evolving. Evolving towards what, we're not told, but it's
progressive, though. We're getting better. Everything's getting better. And
so evolve on gay marriage. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how a sort of moral standard or moral principle changes.
Well, from what I understand, is gay marriage itself was losing at the ballot box, legislative process.
Yes,
it was the courts that imposed.
I remember even in California, of all places.
It was the Supreme Court that finds something in the 14th Amendment, equal protection clause. Did the people who wrote the 14th Amendment anticipate this? I guess they just,
Well, that's the kind of inherent problem with the U.S. Constitution. I think is it was birthed in this kind of Enlightenment liberal rhetoric, and certainly the signers and drafters of the Constitution and the various amendments that came later, they didn't. I don't think in all good faith that they seriously thought about this kind of stuff, but they used the language, they used the rhetoric, which made all of this kind of possible. I think that's the unfortunate thing of the the sort of the inherent flaw in the U.S. Constitution is its over reliance on liberal. Of this time, that 18th century liberalism, and certainly the progressives, could easily seize on that language, seize on that rhetoric to just nudge it further and further and further in their direction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain revolutionary spirit underlying all of it.
Yeah, it's like what Billington writes about in The Fires in the Minds of Men, that both the left and the right have a final destination, which is the same thing, sort of this dialectical materialism.
And, there's a certain Hegelian reading you can give to it.
Yeah, and you have you have sort of a collectivist materialism and a sort of individualistic materialism, which kind of takes you to the same destination, philosophically speaking. And that's something that speaks to the flawed experiment that is America, Enlightenment, and that's a bitter pill for a lot of Americans to swallow, because they like to be patriotic.
Especially American conservatives who have this kind of idea that the U.S. Constitution, which does have its good points. I don't deny that, but
if they followed it.
Yeah, but kind of if you start with this shaky foundation, it's easy to topple it over.
Yeah. Well, yeah, things like good example is the non-establishment clause, which actually only applied to the federal government. You had established states. You did have established churches in the states up until the 1830s or 40s, I think. So it's one of these things where the sort of this incorporation doctrine, which is a sort of a civil a result of the Civil War. The incorporation, the Bill of Rights, the incorporation doctrine, also the 14th Amendment itself is very problematic from a constitutional standpoint. Not only because I don't think it was ratified constitutionally. That's much like the 16th Amendment. There's a lot of it's very dubious, but it's also the fact that the idea that you could just simply write a law that would protect everyone's rights, but at the same time you're creating a multiplicity of excuses for the federal government to destroy state sovereignty, which in the final analysis is a much better protection of people's rights because it establishes federalism, local authority, divided government, as opposed to sort of an all-powerful federal government.
Yeah, and I think I saw one critique of the Constitution that put it essentially that either what's happening now is a fulfillment of the Constitution, in which case the Constitution is a bad thing, or the Constitution is too weak to stop it, in which case it's kind of a useless thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this is the dilemma we face now in the at least in the United States.
Yeah, invoke the Constitution for what? Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's Who was it said that?
I don't recall who said it,
19th century
but it was
guy.
yeah. I think I saw it without attribution, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, if it's too weak to prevent it, then it's no good. If it allows for it, then it's no good. So what do you got?
But yet that's sort of the go-to for these sort of conservatives that Constitution will save us. The Constitution, and I've been hearing that my whole life, and it has.
Well, the Heritage Foundation
come to fruition. Yeah,
the Heritage Foundation mails out the little pocket Constitution you can throw at the police when they're beating you.
Yeah, throw it at the IRS when
throw
they're
at the
seizing
IRS.
your assets. Yeah, when they're seizing your assets, throw it at some federal judge when he's throwing you in jail for some petty thing.
Yeah.
It's superfluous at this point.
Because really, I mean, when it comes down to it, sometimes justice and law is protected sort of unofficially. What I mean by that is sort of street justice. Good example, if you have a rogue official, instead of trying to sue him, just getting a posse out and lynching the son of a bitch is a much better protection. Like they did to Leo Frank. And then the official feels consequences for his or her decision.
Well, and that's the thing we can see with the federal government and even state governments do not seem to really punish their own. So there's no consequences to them. But if I imagine your senator would act a lot better if he was really worried that the torches and pitchforks would be outside his office if he acted up.
Yeah, as Samuel Johnson said, the thought of being hung in the fourth night tends to concentrate the mind. And that's the problem. There's no accountability to a lot of. They hide behind their offices. It's like I don't hate the man, I hate the office. Is the it's no. Ultimately,
And even when it comes to draining the swamp, even Trump and Sessions are pretty slow moving on punishing some of these people.
No, yeah, it's right. There's no accountability. I mean, I just remember if you look back at the brought up earlier, but the Ruby Ridge and also Waco, obviously a disaster. But none of the people that perpetrated that were ever brought to justice or even fired or lost their pension.
Well, even closer to our own times, the Bush administration and the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
None of those people suffered even politically, much less legally, for what they did.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still on all the TV shows, acting as respected analysts in foreign policy or geopolitical analysts, even though 5,000-6,000 U.S. troops died, probably double or triple that were injured, seriously maimed and injured. Upwards, according to some estimates, upwards of 1 million Iraqis dead between the invasion and the subsequent civil war. So, and nobody at any level was punished for that.
Never.
I think at most, what Scooter Libby went to jail for lying,
and then he was,
yeah. He went to sentence commuted, yeah.
Yeah, he went to jail for some. I mean, it is funny.
Yeah.
It's like Al Capone going to jail for tax evasion.
Yeah, but there were nobody was punished again, legally or politically, for that.
Or what's her name? The Judy, the reporter from.
Oh yeah, Miller.
Judith Miller.
Miller, yeah.
Wasn't she Scooter Libby's girlfriend or something?
I think he was her source, wasn't that? I think the one I think about the girlfriend was Petraeus, who had.
Oh, remember? Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Petraeus was all in.
Yeah. But even I see Judy Miller's on Fox a lot. Nowadays.
Yeah, she gets this sort of this sinecure at Fox, and after she does her job in drumming up, the war in Iraq, it kills hundreds of a million people. Yeah.
I mean, and the other one I see is Jim Clapper, who lied to Congress under oath about spying, mass surveillance of American citizens, and now he's a CNN analyst.
Yes,
he's a CNN pundit. So there's no consequences, and then they can just, once they're out of government, they can just leap over to the media or to one of the big companies and suffer nothing for all the awfulness they've brought upon the rest of the world.
Yeah, I heard both Wesley Clark and Madeleine Albright were cashing in on Serbia, former Yugoslavia, the Balkans. I think he was involved in some sort of mineral extraction rights, and she had setting on a board of a company that was privatizing Serbia's communication systems or something. So the pillage, continues, and so the
like with Mattis advising Trump to increase troops in Afghanistan when he has some kind of financial stake in one of the companies that would make a lot of money from further U.S. involvement there.
Yeah, and I think there's like well over 300 and maybe 350 members of Congress that are heavily invested in defense contracting.
Yeah, that's why the Pentagon budget never gets touched.
Another reason also is total surveillance is you can't have effective oversight. Senate Armed Services Committee, these things, if the military if the CIA military intelligence can wiretap people's phones and get the dirt on everybody, you bet. And also,
and we do know the CIA spies on Congress.
Yeah,
I mean, to quote Alex Jones, that's mainstream media.
Yeah. I got documents here.
Yeah. We know that.
Stacks of documents.
So with guys in government positions, they're either paid off or blackmailed to go along with what the establishment wants. Who was it? Denny Hastert with the pedophilia thing. I imagine that's much more widespread than just one or two creepy old congressmen. I mean, I think that's something that if not pedophilia, some other kind of sexual sin, a lot of them, are guilty of, that is used against them to keep them in line.
Yeah, that's probably feeds a lot of the human trafficking that occurs.
Well, I see what's the one now? The senator who's on trial now, Bob Menendez, who's on some kind of corruption trial. But one of the allegations that I saw with him was that he was involved with underage prostitutes in the Dominican Republic.
Okay, yeah.
But that's not, of course, what's going to get the attention. But now, my first thought is,
was it legal there?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know for sure that he did it. It was just alleged, in all fairness. But it's certainly believable. And that's the sort of stuff, that somebody wiretapping him or even setting it up for him, and then, hey, Senator Menendez, look what you did. We have the video or the photographs of it, so you need to go along with what we say on this budget issue or this foreign policy issue. If you don't, guess which media pick which media outlet you want, because they're going to be the first ones to get leaked photos or leaked video.
Yeah, or it's like the scene of The Godfather where the Senator Frank Gehry is giving Michael Corleone a hard time with licensing, gambling license, and he says, here's my deal, I'm going to pay you nothing. And the senator kind of laughs at him. But eventually the senator finds himself next to a dead girl in a bordello. And Tom Hagen, Michael Corleone's consigliere, is there to clean it up for the senator. And the senator becomes an agent for the Corleones. And that happens all the time, one degree or another. And it's either you're caught with a dead girl or a live boy, as the saying goes. And in DC, and blackmail is currency in DC, and it's probably a combination of blackmail and bribery which gets people in line. And again, Denny Hastert's political rise wasn't despite his sexual perversions; it was because of it. People like that are very, very useful.
Yeah.
You don't want an honest man. They can't do business with an honest man.
And that's one of the surprising things to me about Trump is there doesn't seem to be this kind of any major scandal that he was involved in, or else they would have nailed him with it. I mean, the stuff during the end of near the end of the election where they're trying to stick this weird, Hollywood access video thing, and then claiming he touched these women. Yeah. None of that panned out, as far as I know. None of it panned out. Mueller's been investigating for several months now for some corrupt business deal, but nothing has yet come to light. So maybe, I don't know. It just seems he's perhaps one of the reasons the establishment is so hateful towards him is that he doesn't really have any of these scandals which they can twist his arm with. I'm guessing at this point the only thing they can twist his arm with is if you don't listen, you're going to end up like JFK, or you're going to end up like Nixon. Not that you're going to end up like, with a dead, pictures of you with a dead prostitute or a little boy circulated to the media, but rather the direct. I think with him, they had to go directly to the death threats.
I think the whole joke is the president gets inaugurated and he's shown the other
real,
film.
The real Zapruder film.
Any questions? And again, he can be surrounded. I mean, a good example, the Kushner's influence in the administration is troubling. The Zion, obviously surrounded by. So pretty soon, a president can be very easily isolated without killing him, and maybe that's progress. I don't know, but
not just Kushner. I think they forced out Bannon.
That's the way to do these things. And if you look at Watergate, appears to be some sort of coup, and also what Carter went through. With the hostage crisis and the October surprise. It appears that his administration was undermined for whatever independence he asserted himself.
And even Reagan himself seems to have got stuck with Bush Sr. to keep him in line.
You're right, and after the assassination attempt, he was very compliant.
Yeah. So. And in Trump's case, too, I've noticed we see the so-called rise of the generals. You have this kind of junta of McMaster, Mattis, and Kelly, who seem to have who've sort of solidified their control around Trump and keep away anyone who they don't want getting near him. People, like Bannon or some of these other ones who were sort of pushed aside by these generals. And these are in Trump, I think one of his weaknesses is he has this too high of a trust for the generals. There's this sort of, which is a common, I think, American thing, is this sort of fetishizing the military as if, all the other political institutions are rotten or corrupt, but the military, they're the good guys, they're patriotic. Even guys like Alex Jones peddle this kind of thing. The military, they really know what's going on. They're on our side.
The Pentagon's lost $8 trillion. They can't find $8 trillion.
So I think the generals, are that's one of the disconcerting things to me. Is Kushner is certainly a bad influence, but I think even more so increasingly is this rising power that the generals have, where I'm worried that Trump will just become sort of a a figurehead, and you'll have this junta behind the scenes, really, at least in terms of foreign policy and military issues, having a lot more control than they should have. Because technically the military is supposed to be under civilian control, yes. Subservient to civilian control, but yet Trump's given them an awful lot of leeway in both to the CIA and to the military in terms of what they do in Syria, Afghanistan, etc. So there's less and less civilian oversight, which is something I think they might be, they certainly like, because it removes a lot of control and oversight. That to put a finer point on it, that's certainly one of the things I would be concerned about with Trump, is the Pentagon having far too much sway than they should.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of you look at presidents in general, I think their power is overestimated. No man could exert effective control over the massive bureaucracy of the federal government, and also the interests that control Washington D.C. Both domestic and international. It's the imperial city, and that's why it's such a den of iniquity, because there's so much money and power, in that city, the decisions that are taken. But if you really think about it, it's like it's like the people over at Hoaxbusters talk about how many weekends that the president took off. He goes golfing, and John F. Kennedy did this, and they take vacation times. They have more free time than the average person, apparently. So,
yeah, and I think, and to their fairness, what else can they do?
So it's almost like they get there. It's almost like, what do I do? What am I going to do?
Yeah, Yeah, I think this Americans, and indeed I experience it when I'm asked about it by the Koreans, is just this idea that the president is this unitary executive, that he has all this kind of power, and he really doesn't. I mean, he has some power, but he doesn't have the power. We see it with Trump, like he's constantly checked, not just by the other branches, but even within his own administration, within his own, all these departments that have undermined him, like the State Department, Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. These are technically part of the executive branch. These people answer to him, but yet they're sabotaging him. They're undermining him.
Yeah.
Even the FBI, that's under the executive branch. That's, Comey, the recently departed Comey, he was answerable ultimately to Trump, but they're all undermining him. They're all boxing him in. They're all weakening him. So this idea that the president can just, get elected, come into Washington, shake things up, throw people out, and drain the swamp is very, very naive. I think the president of all people probably has a lot less power in many areas than some of the other institutions or branches of government.
Yeah, or just the I would say the corporations and the foundations that exert so much cultural influence, and they control how the media covers things. They control the spin, the Council on Foreign Relations, and their agents in the media and Hollywood, and how they can again coordinate and create a unified message. And you'll see, and there's a method to that. There's a whole mechanism for doing that, and they're the ones that will. It was the CFR that wrote the Marshall Plan. It wasn't General Marshall that wrote it. He was the face that put on it. He was like the Betty Crocker. He was the Ronald McDonald of the plan. And these guys, would put the time in. They represented the corporations, the research, the staff, and all this stuff. People were talking about at the end of World War II how the State Department was, as far as having a desk on the Soviet Union, these things it was the CFR that were the experts, and they went in and they would go in and they would fill all the spots at the State Department. And same thing with intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies weren't created by Congress to protect, the genuine national security of the American people. They were created. It was sort of a formalization of sort of an incestuous relationship that had existed for decades between big business, the banks, and the federal government. and the U.S. Army in these things. And so there was formalized the Second World War, then the subsequent Cold War created the pretext to formalize these relationships, sort of a consummation of this untoward affair that they had. So it became permanent, and that's why we had the Cold War, And so we have a complete misunderstanding of what the FBI is, what the CIA is, and what the Pentagon is. It's corporate run,
And I'm wondering if the dialectic will resolve itself when we have in 2020 Mark Zuckerberg as president. It's just the merger of state and corporate.
Yes, what it is. Yeah. Which is what? What's that term?
Excuse me?
The merger of state and government?
The merger of the state and the corporations.
Now, what is that? Form of government, is that?
Technocracy.
Or fascism? So,
fascism.
So have to get the Antifa involved in that.
But at least like classical fascism has, had things like patriotism, or at least cited it and traditional values or whatever. But
this corporate, monoculture.
Yeah. But I think Zuckerberg, some people have been joking, if he gets elected president, now that, your refrigerator is hooked up to Facebook and everything nowadays, that, if you say a homophobic statement on your social media, your refrigerator will lock you out for 3 days or something.
A homophobic statement is that I think homosexuality is sinful or immoral. That's homophobic.
Yeah.
I don't.
According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, that is a homophobic statement. They blacklisted certain evangelical Christian organizations for
being Christian.
Essentially. Yeah.
So traditional sexual morality.
Yeah.
That's another thing. The revolution that no one. When did this happen?
And that's the funny thing, is because the same things that the Christian groups are getting condemned for, Hillary Clinton said 10 years ago, and Obama said 10 years ago. Oh, I support traditional marriage. I don't think marriage is between two people of the same sex, and blah blah blah. But now the same things Obama and Hillary said 10 years ago is anathema now to say those things.
Yeah, I heard someone casually use the neologism transphobe. Someone who
transphobic.
Is transphobic because you look askance at.
Well, it's hard now to keep up. There's so many new phobias coming out every other week. It's hard to know, what to say or what not to say, because you never know who, which new identity group is going to be created, this week, and how I might offend them by accident.
Yeah. And to harbor or hold on to any sense of traditional morality and such things, I guess you'll just be ostracized. Speaking of the so-called transphobia, these so-called trans people are now pushing the idea, if you're a what they call cisgender male, and you're not attracted to the quote trans female, you're transphobic. Meaning, if I meet a girl and it has an Adam's apple, and
it has a little extra something between the legs, and you're not attracted to it, you're hateful, you're a bigot, you're transphobic.
Wow.
If you don't want to have a sexual relationship with that other person.
Coerced homosexuality.
That's what we're coming to, I think. I see all these schools nowadays with the pictures. I don't know how prevalent it is. Social media might kind of exaggerate or overly amplify it, but I do see a lot of these news stories and pictures where they're bringing in transvestites into kindergartens and first grade, second grade classes. The most freakish, ghoulish-looking people to teach your kids about tolerance, and to teach your kids about gender identity, and to teach your kids all this mental illness, and it's
that's demonic.
That's the state-run school. That's what's sort of coming, and and this is again where the state and the corporations seem to be in agreement, because you have the state schools allowing this horrible, I think, preparing the way for pedophilia, to be honest, propaganda and psyops going on in the school. And then on the other hand, you have Twitter and Facebook and Google trying to shut down anybody who is critical of these things. You know, the corporations shut you up in the media, and the schools the state propagandizes it to your kids, and people are caught in the middle. And what do you do?
Yeah, well, you have to take your kids out of the public school system.
Yeah,
disengage them. I mean, you have to acknowledge malevolence, and that's a consciousness that is required there. There was a Teen Vogue. Even the fact that there's something called Teen Vogue. Vogue magazine is bad enough, but Teen Vogue apparently made an article that was highlighting the benefits and fun of sodomy to kids. Now, if I were to text that to a kid of a 13, 14-year-old, I'd be arrested. But they can post it in a magazine
and not just post it, but it's celebrated. You know, look what they've done. It's I don't know. You kind of point your speechless. You know, what do you say in the face of such a malevolence? And it is malevolent.
Well, you start to become very sympathetic to what Iran says about America, the great Satan.
Oh yeah, I mean, at least in terms of the criticism of American and Western in general, sexual liberation, all this stuff. Yeah, some of the Muslim countries, they're not wrong. In some of their criticisms.
It's it's something else. It's again, you have to acknowledge that this stuff isn't just happening. This is well thought out malevolence that's being carried out. I mean, this started with the so-called AIDS crisis, when they used the AIDS fear to start teaching kids these things, and it was spelled out in the documents. The U.S. Public Health Service. I'm sorry, it wasn't the U.S. Public Health Service. It was the U.S. National Survey working with the Russell Sage Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation, talking about how under the pretext of age education, they would introduce very graphic sex ed programs that would otherwise be opposed to fundamentally change the sexual values of the kids, undermine parental authority. It had nothing to do with the public health matter. And again, using fear of AIDS to do this.
Yeah, because if they were really concerned with public health, they would push the homosexuals to stop their rather disgusting sexual practices. So
now you're being homophobic.
But that's where this stuff came from. I mean, if the homosexuals having, 3 or 4 different sex partners in a few day period, and then doing that over several years,
and the drugs, the
drugs,
ammonium nitrates, the drugs, these things suppress their immune system, which the whole HIV thing is very problematic. But
but just in terms,
because more civilized, restraint homosexuals didn't come down with AIDS. So and also the ones that didn't take AZT lived. So, so, and there's a whole angle there with AZT, the whole scam with that, man. That's a whole other can of worms. So, but man,
and even with this, you now have these I don't know, like you get. There was the story about a homosexual man on one of these dating apps or hookup apps. He mentioned he didn't want a partner who already had AIDS, and so the AIDS-infected homosexuals were up in outroar that this other homosexual could be so hateful that he doesn't want to have sex with other men who are already infected. So you've just reached like peak lunacy with this stuff.
When I was dating, I had a fetish. I always wanted to have a girl that had gonorrhea or syphilis. It was just me. I was like, what the hell? Jeez.
Because every healthy human being should want to get some kind of STD.
Yeah.
That seems to be the point.
Man, remember that? I mean, it used to be, remember the health department would send a notice if you had syphilis or something. They'd contact your partners. You'd have to start, if you came out with a test, they used to have a, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to make you, if you tested positive, you'd have to provide a list of people you've been intimate with, and they'd get a warning. They used to give a syphilis test before you got married.
Yeah, even here I have to get in Seoul. I have to get tested for it before I get a job.
Really?
As a foreigner.
Yeah. So yeah.
Because they don't want infected people in the country. So
Well, now the federal government, imagine the federal government want to import them here for whatever reason.
Well, I think previously they did have blocks on allowing immigration of people with these serious, untreatable, sexually transmitted diseases, but Obama removed a lot of those restrictions.
Well, because it's hateful. You're discriminating.
Yeah,
discrimination is bad, right?
Yeah.
So, man. So, well, Dan, I think we're over 2 hours. Yeah, wow.
Yeah,
time flies, man. We're going to keep. Now we're getting close to that time, so I don't want to. I'll be a man of my word here. I don't want to keep any longer than you have decided to give me. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time.
Yeah, no problem.
So I'll let you go, and I will post this probably early next week. When I do, I will send you the link.
All right.
Great. So, Dan, thanks a lot. That's Dan Spaulding.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. He's writes for Seoul the East. Any other places you write for lately? Is you still?
Actually, in truth, I haven't written much maybe in the past year or so. Yeah. Just personal and professional obligations have been sort of overwhelming. But I do recommend, just on a personal, people check out my friend Jay Dyer's work. I know he's a frequent guest of yours. Mm-hmm. 21st Century Wire. Patrick Henningsen does a lot of good stuff over there. So I recommend, in the meantime, checking out those places.
Great. Okay, listen, thanks a lot. I'll let you get on with your Sunday out there and enjoy the fall. And I guess you've winter to look forward, fall and winter. Is fall and winter nice there, or what's it like? Just curious.
It's not too different from the U.S. You have the distinct 4 seasons.
So it's like that. Okay. So, yeah, I know from watching MASH, I know it can get very cold and hot there. So from watching the TV show, I remember that.
Yeah, the winter can get cold, but there's not a lot of snow in the winter, but it's cold.
Just cold, yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, listen. Thanks a lot, Dan. I'll let you go. And
thanks for having me. Yeah.
Take care.
Good night.